tend to see things like ADHD or OCD and addiction as totally separate problems, almost like, inherent flaws.
Right. Distinct diagnoses.
Exactly. But what if they're actually, well, interconnected? What if they're driven by something deeper than just our biology, maybe even adaptive?
That's precisely what we're going to dig into today. We'll be exploring the really insightful work of Dr. Gabor Maté, specifically his trauma-informed view. And we'll pair that with acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, especially trauma-focused ACT.
Okay.
And we'll also bring in perspectives from like polyvagal theory, internal family systems, attachment theory, and look at the impact of things often missed, like emotional neglect or even guilt and shame.
So our aim here is to give you, the learner, a kind of shortcut to understanding these quite complex ideas. We want to show some maybe surprising connections and offer a different lens, moving away from that "what's wrong with you" question towards something more like "what happened to you?" The idea is you feel well-informed, but not bogged down by jargon.
Right. And I'll be here providing some analysis and the wider context.
And I'll jump in to highlight interesting bits and, well, make sure we're keeping it clear. Okay, so where do we start? Maté.
Let's start with Dr. Gabor Maté.
Yeah.
He really throws down a challenge to those conventional models that look mainly at genetics or, specific brain deficits for ADHD, OCD, addiction.
Yeah, he really does push back on the purely biological explanation. His central idea, which I think connects with a lot of people, is that our early life, particularly trauma, maybe even emotional neglect, is fundamental in shaping these conditions.
Exactly. It's about the shaping environment.
So let's talk ADHD first. How does he see that fitting in?
Well, Maté, in his book Scattered Minds, he suggests looking at ADHD less as a disorder and more as an adaptive response to early stress, specifically when a child's fundamental needs for connection, for safety, aren't consistently met.
Okay, so the symptoms we associate with ADHD, the distractibility, hyperactivity, impulsivity, he reframes those.
He does. He sees them not as errors, but as potential coping mechanisms. For instance, what looks like distractibility might have begun as hypervigilance, a child needing to constantly scan their environment, maybe tracking unpredictable caregivers,
That makes a lot of sense, actually, needing to know what's coming next.
Right. And he really emphasizes the brain as a social organ, meaning its development, especially early on, is profoundly shaped by the relational environment. This is crucial when thinking about neurotransmitters like dopamine, often implicated in ADHD. The regulation gets shaped by experience.
And this leads to what might be, for some, a kind of controversial idea he puts forward, doesn't it, about ADHD being potentially reversible.
Yes, he talks about it as reversible impairment, suggesting that with healing, with the right kind of supportive environment, the underlying issues that drive the symptoms can be addressed, leading to significant change, not just symptom management.
Which is a very different message than "you have this condition for life." It points towards healing the root cause.
Exactly. It encourages looking at the person's whole story, their emotional history. Now, what about OCD? Maté hasn't dedicated a full book to it, but his trauma lens still applies, right?
It absolutely does. We can apply his thinking.
So he would likely suggest that the repetitive thoughts, the compulsive behaviors in OCD, are attempts to impose order and predictability on an inner world that feels chaotic, maybe frightening, often stemming from past experiences of instability or fear. Control becomes a survival strategy.
So those compulsions, the checking, the cleaning, whatever it might be, they become these desperate attempts to feel safe externally when things feel internally out of control. Maybe because things were out of control earlier in life.
Precisely. It's an attempt to regulate that internal state of fear or overwhelm. And, consistent with his overall approach, Maté would urge us to look beyond the symptom. So instead of just asking, why the compulsion, the more vital question is, why the underlying pain? What fear is this trying to manage?
Right. He argues these conditions are often signaling deeper, unresolved emotional wounds. And this really comes into sharp focus with addiction, doesn't it? That's where his work, like in the realm of Hungry Ghosts, has had such a massive impact.
A huge impact, yes. His perspective on addiction is incredibly influential. He fundamentally reframes it, moving away from ideas of moral failure or simply a disease of the brain,
Right.
to understanding it as a response, primarily, to profound pain and unresolved trauma.
And that core question he poses, not why the addiction, but why the pain. That just completely shifts the focus, doesn't it? It directs us straight to the person's inner suffering.
It does. And Maté emphasizes the deep legacy of childhood trauma, not just overt abuse or neglect, which are clearly significant, but also those more subtle forms like emotional absence.
Mhm.
A parent might be physically present, but just not attuned and not emotionally available to the child's actual needs.
And this isn't just psychological, it's neurological too, right? This early chronic stress actually impacts brain development.
Absolutely. It disrupts the development of crucial brain systems involved in reward, impulse control, emotional regulation, making individuals more vulnerable later on to seeking external sources of comfort or escape.
So addiction, from this viewpoint, becomes a form of self-medication, a way to cope with overwhelming feelings like shame, fear, loneliness, feelings that perhaps weren't soothed or validated early on.
Exactly. It's an attempt at emotional survival when other healthier ways of regulating or connecting weren't available or learned. He developed compassionate inquiry as a therapeutic approach to gently explore these underlying stories. And importantly, he also highlights the role of broader social factors like inequality, alienation, lack of community in contributing to addiction.
So looking across ADHD, OCD, and addiction, Mate offers this unifying, compassionate lens. It's that fundamental shift. What happened to you? Not what's wrong with you. Seeing these conditions as adaptations to pain.
And a really significant form of that early pain, often overlooked, is emotional neglect.
Ah, yes, emotional neglect. It can be so insidious because it's about what didn't happen, right? Not necessarily overt harm, but a lack of emotional presence or responsiveness.
Precisely. And our sources emphasize how profoundly this can shape a child's development. It essentially tunes their coping strategies to survive in an environment where their emotional needs just aren't seen or met. They learn to suppress feelings, disconnect.
And this tuning can manifest in ways that look a lot like the conditions we're discussing.
Definitely. With ADHD-like traits, for example, the inattention might stem from learning to dissociate or tune out when emotional needs are ignored. Restlessness or hyperactivity could be ways to distract from internal emptiness or anxiety. And without consistent co-regulation from a caregiver, developing self-regulation skills for impulses and emotions becomes much harder.
Okay, that makes sense. And for OCD-like patterns.
In an emotionally unreliable environment, a child might develop a rigid need for routines or control over their surroundings to create a sense of internal safety they aren't getting from relationships. Compulsions could become ways to displace or manage overwhelming feelings, easier to focus on an external ritual than the internal pain of neglect.
And the link with addiction seems pretty direct, too, filling that internal void.
Very clear. Maté talks about that hungry ghost, feeling the emptiness stemming from that lack of early connection and attunement. Substances or compulsive behaviors offer a temporary way to numb that pain or create a false sense of fullness or connection.
And it doesn't stop there, does it? Emotional neglect can lead to other coping styles, too.
Oh, absolutely. Things like intense people-pleasing, perfectionism, becoming a workaholic, social withdrawal, even a harsh self-criticism. These can all be understood as learned strategies to navigate a world where your inner emotional life wasn't validated or supported. Internalizing critical voices, perhaps.
It's like these become deeply ingrained survival tactics learned in childhood. Okay, let's pivot slightly and bring in some neuroscience polyvagal theory.
Right. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory gives us a richer map of our autonomic nervous system than just fight or flight. It outlines this hierarchy. The ventral vagal state, that's where we feel safe, connected, social. Then the sympathetic state, the classic fight or flight mobilization. And the dorsal vagal state, which is more about shut down, freeze, collapse.
And trauma, especially that early ongoing kind, really messes with the system, right? It can get us stuck in these states.
Exactly. It dysregulates the system. Someone might be chronically stuck in sympathetic hyperarousal, always scanning for danger, or in dorsal hyperarousal, feeling numb, disconnected, shut down, or bouncing between them.
And you can see how these states might relate to the symptoms we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Think about ADHD-like patterns. Someone often in that sympathetic on-alert state might present as hyperactive, restless, easily distracted because they're constantly scanning for threats.
Okay. And OCD.
The rituals and rigidity could be seen through this lens as attempts to regulate a nervous system stuck in anxiety, trying to create predictability and safety when the internal feeling is one of threat or chaos.
And addictions. A way to manage the nervous system.
Kind of like DIY, nervous system regulation,
Wow.
yeah. Using substances or behaviors to try and artificially shift states, maybe calm down from hyperarousal or try to feel something when stuck in that numb, shut down dorsal state. And dissociation itself is often seen as a manifestation of that dorsal vagal shutdown.
It really drives home how these aren't just mental states, but deeply embodied physiological responses learned for survival. Okay, how about internal family systems, IFS?
IFS, developed by Richard Schwartz, offers another really helpful lens. It views the mind not as a single entity, but as having multiple parts, almost like an inner family. There's the core, self-compassionate, curious, calm, and then protective parts. Managers who try to keep things under control, firefighters who react intensely to extinguish pain, and exiles who hold the vulnerable feelings and trauma memories.
And trauma makes these parts take on more extreme roles.
Precisely. They get forced into these protective, sometimes rigid roles. A manager part might become hypercritical or perfectionistic to prevent future hurt or perceived failure. You could see how this might show up in ADHD-like patterns. Maybe a manager trying desperately to impose order on internal chaos, leading to shame when things fall apart.
And the firefighters, they're the impulsive reactors.
Yes, they jump in when exiled pain gets triggered, often using intense strategies like rage, substance use, self-harm, binging anything to douse the immediate flames. Addictions, from an IFS view, are often driven by these firefighter parts trying desperately to quell the pain held by the exiles.
It paints a picture of inner conflict, but also inner wisdom, with all parts trying to help in their own way, even if the strategy is now causing problems, protecting those vulnerable exiled parts. Now, attachment theory, how does that weave in?
Attachment theory, starting with Bowlby and Ainsworth, is fundamental. It looks at how those first bonds with caregivers shape our internal working models, our blueprints for relationships, our expectations of safety, connection, and our own worthiness.
And if those early bonds are inconsistent, neglectful, or scary, it leads to insecure attachment styles, like anxious, avoidant.
Exactly. Anxious, preoccupied, dismissive, avoidant, fearful, avoidant, or disorganized. These patterns develop based on how caregivers responded, or didn't respond, to the child's needs for safety and connection. Relational trauma or neglect is often the root.
And these styles impact how we cope later on.
Significantly. A child who didn't consistently receive soothing co-regulation might struggle with emotional self-regulation. Later think ADHD-like emotional volatility.
Yeah.
Strong need for control, sometimes seen in OCD, might be a defense against the felt insecurity or unpredictability of early relationships. Addictions can serve as substitutes for the secure connection that was missing, and dissociation can be a way to disconnect from the pain of unreliable or frightening relationships.
It really underscores how foundational those early relational experiences are for everything that follows. Now, we also need to talk about guilt and shame. They seem like such powerful undercurrents.
Absolutely crucial. They are incredibly potent emotions, often operating unconsciously, but deeply tuning our nervous system and driving behavior. It's useful to distinguish them. Guilt is often about behavior, I did something bad. Shame is more about identity. I am bad.
And chronic guilt, maybe not even linked to a specific wrongdoing like survivor guilt, or just a pervasive sense of owing something that can really influence these conditions.
It really can. For ADHD-like patterns, think about inattention as maybe avoiding thoughts or feelings linked to guilt. Hyperactivity could be unconsciously trying to outrun that feeling of culpability. Impulsivity might be an escape, or even a form of self-punishment. Procrastination, too, can be tied to avoiding tasks that trigger guilt.
And with OCD, how does guilt play in?
Compulsions can feel like attempts at atonement, trying to undo perceived wrongs. There can be intense moral obsessions, constant rumination fueled by guilt, perfectionism driven by a fear of doing wrong.
And the guilt addiction cycle, that seems particularly vicious.
It really is. Using substances to numb guilt, then feeling more guilt because of the consequences of using, which fuels more use. It's a trap. Addiction can become a form of slow self-destruction rooted in guilt, or a way to avoid responsibility. And of course, guilt often drives isolation, that fear of judgment, feeling unworthy of connection.
And then there's shame. That feels even deeper, more fundamental, that core belief of being flawed.
Yes, shame often sits right at the heart of trauma. It can stem from abuse, neglect, constant criticism, being valued only for performance, societal stigma. When shame gets internalized, it powerfully shapes survival strategies.
So how might shame manifest in these conditions?
ADHD. Shame can amplify rejection sensitivity, making feedback feel devastating. Inattention might be a flight response from the unbearable feeling of inadequacy. Hyperactivity could be an avoidance of the stillness where shame resides. Impulsivity might be a release of unbearable tension, or even self-sabotage driven by feeling undeserving.
And in OCD.
Shame can fuel crippling perfectionism, the desperate hope that flawlessness can cover the perceived inner defect. It can drive secrecy around obsessions deemed shameful, moral, sexual, harm-related.
And the shame addiction link is profound, too.
Incredibly so. Addiction becomes a primary way to self-medicate the agony of shame, to escape a self felt as intolerable. It feeds the shame addiction spiral. Often there's a deep feeling of not deserving help or recovery. And shame is a huge driver of isolation, hiding the defective self, fearing intimacy, silencing one's own experiences.
Wow, understanding guilt and shame as these powerful hidden drivers really adds another layer. Okay, let's shift focus now to solutions, or at least ways of working with this. Stephen Hayes and Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, ACT.
Right. So while Mate helps us understand the what happened, ACT, developed by Stephen Hayes, offers a framework for changing our relationship with our internal experience now, regardless of the origin story.
Okay, so it's less about digging into the past and more about the present.
Exactly. The core aim of ACT is psychological flexibility. That's the ability to contact the present moment fully as a conscious human being, and based on what the situation affords, change or persist in behavior in the service of chosen values. It involves 6 core processes: acceptance, diffusion, being present, self as context, the observing self, identifying values, and taking committed action.
So, how does ACT approach trauma specifically? It's not about getting rid of the memories, is it?
No, not at all. It's about developing acceptance of the difficult thoughts, feelings, sensations, and memories associated with trauma, allowing them to be there without struggle. It involves defusion learning to see trauma-related thoughts, like "I'm damaged," as just thoughts, not literal truths. And critically, it helps people clarify what truly matters to them, their values, and take steps towards that, even with the pain. Hayes emphasizes a process-based approach, identifying which flexibility processes are most stuck due to trauma.
And for ADHD, how can ACT help?
ACT offers tools like mindfulness adapted for focus challenges, fostering acceptance of frustration and restlessness instead of fighting them, diffusion from negative self-talk, "I'm useless, I can't focus," and connecting actions to personal values rather than just immediate impulses or avoidance.
Makes sense. And OCD?
With OCD, ACT aims to end the war with obsessions. It encourages radical acceptance of intrusive thoughts, diffusion, seeing them as mental noise, not commands or truths, and undermining compulsions by choosing willingness to feel the anxiety without performing the ritual, all in the service of living a valued life beyond OCD's dictates.
And addictions.
ACP views addiction as experiential avoidance, trying to escape unwanted feelings. So it teaches acceptance of cravings, urge surfing, diffusion from thoughts that promote using "I need this, just one won't hurt," connecting with values as the motivation for recovery, and taking committed action towards sobriety or harm reduction, even when it's uncomfortable. Now, Russ Harris has done a fantastic job making these ACT principles really practical and accessible.
Yeah, Russ Harris is great at translating the theory into usable tools, especially for trauma with TFACT, trauma-focused ACT.
Absolutely. Harris really emphasizes that in TFACT, safety and stabilization come first. You can't dive into trauma work if the person doesn't feel fundamentally safe, both in their body and in the therapy space. He talks about compassionate exposure, often using that phrase "dip in, dip out," gently touching on difficult material, then grounding back in safety.
And he really brings the body into it, doesn't he? Somatic awareness.
Hugely important. He integrates somatic mindfulness, recognizing trauma lives in the body. Practices focus on building bodily safety, gently releasing stored activation, fight, flight, freeze, and reconnecting with physical sensations in a safe way. There's also a huge emphasis on shifting from shame and self-attack towards self-compassion, using ACT diffusion and acceptance skills to soften that inner critic. And finding meaning and growth through values is central. Identifying what matters now becomes the compass for moving forward.
And he's applied these practical ACT ideas to ADHD too, right? Based on his own experience.
Yes, he offers very specific ADHD-friendly mindfulness short active exercises. He uses ACT to scaffold executive function skills, build emotional regulation capacities, work on letting go of the shame, often linked with ADHD, and connect productivity with values, not just external demands.
And for OCD, what's his practical take?
Again, it's about radical acceptance of the obsessions, lots of diffusion techniques to unhook from the thoughts, and crucially, using ACT to enhance standard exposure and response prevention, ERP. Values provide the motivation to face the fear during exposures, making it more meaningful than just anxiety reduction. And self-compassion is woven throughout.
And addictions, urge surfing.
Exactly. Teaching skills like urge surfing to ride out cravings without acting, diffusion from addictive thinking, using values clarification to build motivation for change, and committed action taking steps towards recovery despite the discomfort. So let's maybe solidify what TFACT really involves.
Okay, yeah. So TFACT isn't like a whole separate therapy model, but it's applying those core ACT processes in a very trauma-aware way.
That's a great way to put it. Key features include, first, that solid trauma-informed foundation, understanding the neurobiology, the attachment dynamics, explicitly addressing shame and guilt. Second, safety and stabilization are paramount grounding, resourcing, building regulation skills before deeper work.
And that gentle, flexible approach to exposure we mentioned, dipping in and out.
Yes, always compassionate, always paced by the client, and always linked to their values. Why are they choosing to face this pain? TFACT also provides specific strategies for working with dissociation grounding techniques, working with parts from an ACT perspective, strengthening connection to the observing self.
And that crucial shift from self-criticism to self-compassion.
Absolutely vital. Using diffusion and acceptance to soften self-attacks, connecting with the observing self's capacity for kindness, and taking compassionate actions towards oneself. Then there's the somatic integration body awareness practices, helping complete thwarted survival responses physically, using movement for regulation. And finally, it all circles back to values and post-traumatic growth, clarifying what matters now, and taking steps towards that life, fostering growth alongside healing.
It sounds incredibly thorough and humane. Okay, let's zoom back out to that central theme. The overlooked link between trauma and ADHD, OCD, and addictions.
Right. And it's crucial to reiterate, it's not always a simple A causes B, but a complex interaction. We see huge symptom overlap between complex trauma, CPTSD, and ADHD. Attention hyperactivity, impulsivity, emotion regulation, executive function issues can look very similar. Trauma exposure is a known risk factor for developing ADHD, potentially altering brain development.
And it can go the other way, too. ADHD increasing trauma risk.
Yes, the relationship can be bidirectional. Impulsivity or social challenges associated with ADHD might increase vulnerability to traumatic experiences. And trauma can certainly exacerbate ADHD symptoms. This overlap sadly leads to frequent misdiagnosis, getting only the ADHD label without addressing underlying trauma. A trauma-informed assessment is key.
And with OCD, we talked about it emerging as a coping strategy post-trauma, that attempt to regain control.
Exactly. Often the content of the obsessions or compulsions can directly relate to the nature of the trauma fears about safety, contamination, morality, responsibility. Trauma can definitely intensify OCD symptoms, and standard OCD treatments like ERP often need careful adaptation to be trauma sensitive.
And the trauma addiction link feels almost undeniable at this point, the self-medication trap.
It's incredibly strong. Trauma significantly impacts the brain's stress response and reward pathways, increasing vulnerability. The ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, research clearly shows a dose-response relationship. More ACEs, higher risk of addiction. PTSD and substance use disorders co-occur at very high rates. Effective addiction treatment must be trauma-informed.
So these connections are profound, which brings us back to that powerful reframe, being tuned for survival.
Yes, this is maybe the core takeaway, that these symptoms, these conditions, are often not pathologies, but adaptive survival strategies. Trauma tunes the system towards threat detection, emotional avoidance, dysregulation, because that's what was needed to survive an overwhelming environment.
And we can see this tuning in ADHD-like symptoms. Hypervigilance becomes inattention to the right things, mobilization becomes hyperactivity, rapid response becomes impulsivity, lack of co-regulation leads to emotional dysregulation.
Precisely. And in OCD-like patterns, the intense need for control, the obsessions as displaced anxieties, the compulsions as protective rituals, the avoidance of internal chaos, all attempts to create safety and predictability.
And addictions, the emotional escape, the substitute regulation, the ritualistic control, the search for connection, sometimes even repeating trauma patterns, and dissociation as the ultimate escape hatch.
Exactly. And seeing it this way matters profoundly. It fosters compassion instead of blame. It helps us see purpose, not just pathology. It shifts the focus to healing the underlying nervous system dysregulation, not just managing symptoms. It points towards integration, not fragmentation. And it guides us towards effective healing modalities, trauma-informed therapy, somatic work, IFS, ACT, EMDR.
Now, is there a difference in how this tuning looks depending on the type of trauma, like PTSD versus complex PTSD?
Yes, that's an important distinction. PTSD often stems from a single event or limited period. CPTSD arises from prolonged, repeated trauma, often relational, starting in childhood. The tuning is different.
How so?
With PTSD, avoidance might be more focused on specific triggers, reminding of the event. Emotional dysregulation might be intense, but more situational. With CPTSD, the patterns are typically more pervasive. Avoidance might involve relationships, emotions, parts of oneself. Emotional dysregulation is often chronic, sometimes with explosive anger or deep despair, maybe self-harm or addiction as coping. Dissociation can be more chronic and profound, affecting identity.
And relationships are often more deeply impacted in CPTSD.
Yes, core attachment wounds, deep mistrust, patterns like fawning or trauma bonding are common. There's often a more pervasive negative self-concept, chronic shame, feeling fundamentally different. The functional impairment tends to be more constant compared to potentially more episodic difficulties in PTSD. This means treatment for CPTSD usually needs to be longer term, phased focusing heavily on safety, stabilization, and relational repair before directly processing fragmented trauma memories.
And underpinning all this are actual changes in the brain and body, right?
Yeah.
Neurobiology.
Yeah, absolutely. Chronic trauma can lead to things like a hyperreactive amygdala, fear center, underactive prefrontal cortex, reasoning, regulation, changes in the hippocampus, memory, neurotransmitter imbalances, the window of tolerance narrows, and epigenetics suggests trauma can change gene expression, potentially increasing vulnerability across generations.
And the body holding the score, somatic trauma.
Yes, Bessel van der Kolk's work highlights this. Trauma gets stored physically. Somatic experiencing, for instance, focuses on helping the body complete those stuck survival responses: fight, flight, freeze. Eugene Gedlin's felt sense work also taps into this bodily knowing.
And we should remember trauma exists on a spectrum, right? Not just big T trauma.
Crucial point. The ACE's research showed the cumulative impact of little t traumas, emotional neglect, household dysfunction, etc. And resilience isn't about being unaffected. It's about adaptation. We could even see post-traumatic growth, positive psychological changes emerging from the struggle.
And timing matters for healing, early intervention.
It can make a big difference, yes, leveraging neuroplasticity. But the brain remains capable of change throughout life. That's the hope offered by therapies like TFACT, EMDR, TFCBT, compassion-focused therapy. They provide pathways to retune these survival adaptations towards greater flexibility, connection, and well-being.
So wrapping this all up, the big picture is really about these profound, often missed connections between trauma, including neglect, guilt, shame, and conditions like ADHD, OCD, and addiction, seeing them less as inherent flaws.
And more as resourceful, though often painful, adaptations for survival, tuned for survival.
And the really hopeful part is that this tuning isn't necessarily permanent. With understanding, with compassion, with the right kind of support like TFACT and other trauma-informed approaches.
These patterns can be gently retuned towards healing, integration, and growth. It is possible to build a life guided by values, even with a history of pain.
So, for you, the learner, perhaps considering this trauma-informed lens can reframe how you see yourself or maybe someone else in your life. Maybe it even sparks curiosity to explore some of these therapies further. It's a shift from judgment to understanding.
A powerful shift indeed.
Thank you so much for walking us through all of that today. Really fascinating connections.
It was my pleasure. Important conversations to have.
Absolutely. And if you want to dive deeper into any of these areas, we definitely encourage looking into the work of the researchers and clinicians we've mentioned. There's a wealth of information out there. It's a continuous journey of learning.